Okay, gracias por alzar esa bandera. Over 500 years ago, Santo Domingo was the site of the apocalypse. It was the beginning of the end for the way of life of indigenous Americans across the two continents we now know as North and South America. But in the time since, Santo Domingo and the rest of the island that became known as Hispaniola became a site of great neglect, devastation, violence, poverty, and illness. All of these years later, Santo Domingo was the site of a smaller tragedy, a terrible IShowSpeed live stream, which was part of a series recently concluded in which the famous streamer Speedy Boykins IShowSpeed toured the Caribbean and for 24 hours spent time in different countries in the Caribbean showcasing their culture, way of life, etc. I was nervous about the Dominican Republic stream as a Dominican because things like this can easily go poorly. I've definitely seen in other parts of the world when Speed has visited that there have been certain countries that have felt quite sad about the way in which their country was represented, whether it had to do with the tour guides, whether it had to do with the states of the cities that he visited. And so seeing the way that it turned out leaves me with a lot of thoughts. And it makes me realize that it's really important that we talk about Dominican history and Dominican culture and society. And I'm no expert on these matters. I've done as much research as I can, but there's so much research I still have yet to do. I'm also Dominican York, okay? I'm a Dominican New Yorker, Dominican American. I've only lived for a couple of years in Santo Domingo, and so my perspective is a bit different from what you would encounter in different parts of the Dominican Republic. You might also notice that I'm Asian. That's because my grandfather was Chinese, but both of my parents were from Santo Domingo. And I have raíces in parts of the north in the Dominican Republic as well. So today what we're going to do is we're going to have a thoughtful conversation about Dominican identity, about why Dominicans are like this. There's so much talk on the internet about the way Dominicans are, from the tight t-shirts and accents and the slang to their conceptions of race, their conceptions of religion. Today we're not going to settle for cheap I know black I Dominican jokes. We're actually going to deconstruct some of these tropes and the history behind them to showcase that Dominicans are actually way more complicated and diverse than you think that they are, and their history is one that is tragic, that is filled with resistance, struggle, and devastation, but Dominicans of all different types persist in all different types of ways. And again, my hope is that this can be thoughtful, it can be nuanced, to use a word that I dislike. It can be an empathetic conversation wherein I keep my cool but will inevitably run into some emotion talking about these things. And so to begin that thoughtful and nuanced conversation, I will start with a meme that kind of expresses some of the feelings that I'm having and many others are having right now.
Que dure 30 días lloviendo mierda en República Dominicana hasta que la mierda dé al pecho, que la mierda no pare de caer del cielo. Eso es lo que yo le pido al país, a Dios, al universo, a lo que sea, al diablo, a lo extraterrestre, a lo que sea. Ver el país con una lluvia de mierda, de churria, que dé hasta el pecho, para que el país ya se quede cagado. Ese es mi deseo del corazón que tengo.
Oh, man. We're gonna have to play some Spanish language stuff inevitably. I speak Spanish, though not perfectly. But the purpose of this video is to relate to an English-speaking audience. So, the translation you saw on screen was in fact accurate. He is in fact wishing for a rain of poop on the Dominican Republic. And this is the kind of pessimism that you'll run into in the DR. It's a historically entrenched pessimism, to be very honest with you. A pessimism about politics, about corruption, about money, about the way that the world works. I mean, the ways that Dominicans think are very colored by the assumption that nothing will go right for Dominicans, and this feeling of constant embarrassment and like scorned hopes that one day the Dominican people will prosper, will advance, da. And people take that in many different directions. A lot of them can do it in a way that honestly I don't support, because a lot of it can be elitist, including from Dominican Yorkers from a progressive standpoint, looking down on the ways in which Dominicans operate. A lot of it can be Dominicans in the Dominican Republic with all types of biases in all types of directions about what it means for Dominicans to be shown in a positive light. That being said, after seeing the way that the stream went down, the feeling within me, it was like this rage, but also this laughter, I just felt beside myself scrolling, seeing the things on the timeline. Just to give you guys a taste without getting any closer, let's start with the question, why did the Dominican Republic stream go so poorly in comparison to other Caribbean countries? Okay, so for some examples, we have this one incident where, one of the hosts asks IShowSpeed, a Black American, why he wants watermelon. It's a very awkward and, let's say, racially charged moment, but you'll need the context to understand even further why people would take it this way.
How do you like it? You like citrus?
All right, watermelon.
Okay, de sandía, ¿tú tienes? De sandía.
Why watermelon? Why?
Why watermelon?
Yeah.
Because I'm black.
Okay, negro, y a los negros.
You might notice that the person asking him this question would also be racialized as black in a lot of places. This is alofoke. Alofoke music, alofoke RD. This is the person we're going to be talking about in a bit. To let you know, this is the person who was essentially conducting the trip and navigating with IShowSpeed, showing off Santo Domingo. He's a controversial figure to say the least. You might also wonder then why he wouldn't pick up on perhaps the racially charged nature of asking Speed why he wants watermelon. There is a possibility that this was actually a miscommunication or misunderstanding. Speed certainly kind of takes on the racially charged nature of it, but he also will do that sometimes with humor. So it's quite awkward in general.
¿Te gusta la sandía?
Tiene que tener una cosa más exótica aquí.
We have more exotic stuff here.
What he's trying to say is that we have more exotic fruits, so why pick watermelon? Okay, sure. Well, that's one incident that certainly got a lot of attention. There's also just generally the way in which a lot of the time was spent in a car.
Saca punta ahí, you know the dick.
What?
The dick. The dick. You don't have, you know?
What the hell? Saca puta.
The sun say that.
Bro, yo, Phantom, bro.
It's great.
So, this might be also a bit of a negative interpretation, but this is just one of numerous clips where people are noticing how uncomfortable Speed kind of got with alofoke's vibe over the course of the stream. And part of the problem, too, is that alofoke doesn't speak English. He knows some stuff in English, but not very much. So you would wonder why he would be in charge of something like this, given that Speed doesn't speak Spanish. It definitely made for a lot of awkwardness and difficulty in communication, but also there's just a certainty about the way alofoke's demeanor was, the way that he was focusing on kind of marketing himself through the stream that a lot of people complained about. Perhaps like his inability to properly communicate historical things and cultural things beyond just engagement bait or things that are exciting or whatever. And that's kind of alofoke's brand, as we'll get into. Eventually, Phantom, the Dominican American streamer, did meet up with Speed in this stream, and they hung out. And there was this one moment in time where alofoke basically is trying to ask Speed if he's the money man. He's like asking him, so what do you do with your money? Because you don't show off that you have money, but do you got money? And it was like, at that point, Speed has this reaction of like, man, why are you asking all these personal questions? Also, an incident that I'm choosing not to show, in which apparently IShowSpeed was SA'd or sexually harassed at the very least during the stream by somebody who I don't know, but is apparently another one of these kind of like shocking Dominican influencer types, but doing so with this very like, let's just say gay but homophobic thing going on. It's very weird. A lot of things just, sometimes when Dominican stuff, you see it and you're just like, I don't know how to explain this. I just feel strange and embarrassed. And yeah, people have mentioned, for instance, the difference in how he was perceived, Speed that is, in different parts of the Caribbean versus like how he was received in the DR by his hosts. The differences in how the hosts treated them. So they compare, for instance, Eladio Carrion, who was one of the hosts of IShowSpeed's trip to Puerto Rico, which apparently went really well, versus alofoke. Eladio to Speed, you watch anime, alofoke to Speed, you the money man. One approached him like a person, the other approached him like a paycheck. And then you also have clips from the Jamaica stream that followed. This person, Irving Mercedes, what a huge difference between iSpeed's stream in Jamaica and the one here in RD, in Dominican Republic. 0 motorcyclists and a young guy talking to him about history and culture. But what culture could alofoke talk about if he doesn't know it himself? So yeah, there was multiple really cool like political nuggets and historical information that Speed got during his Jamaica stream, like learning about Nanny of the Maroons or learning about the Mau Mau Rebellion and how that inspired the dreadlocks movement in Jamaica. But Dominicans, we couldn't have that. We can't have good things. Okay? Estamos dejados. We can't have good things. We don't have happiness. We don't have political education. We don't have historical education. We just have you the money man. We have chope. I don't want to say this word, but a lot of people were calling it choperia. There was a lot of showing off of like basically like the more lascivious dembow urbano stuff in the Dominican Republic, which is very closely related to alofoke's brand. There was a performance by the dembocero J1 that Speed seemed to be enjoying at least somewhat. There was some merengue involved. Que maldita vaina, loco. It could have went so much better, bro. You're right, young cash register. You're right. That's not even to talk about the most infamous thing that happened during this stream. See, there was a silver lining in all of this in that the viewer count for this stream was off the chain. 1.5 million concurrent viewers live. And look at Speed, you know, he's like emotional. Alofoke is, you know, acting emotional. All of this is like this big moment. People wouldn't think, you know, the Dominican Republic could be capable of producing this many live viewers, right? But it happened, right? And then all of a sudden it went to 1.6. By the way, yeah, so to be clear, this is 500,000 more than their previous highest, which was 1 million at the same time, I think in Indonesia. When they got to 1.6, things got a little bit different energy-wise. And this is the face that kind of started everything. So, you know, there's ambiguity here, but I think a lot of people in retrospect looked at this moment and saw it as a moment where Speed was starting to catch on that something was off here. This person notes that, yeah, Speed's team had already told him that something was off and there was a bot, and that's why he made that face. And indeed, the next day, Speed made an announcement to his fans.
Oh yeah, chat, about that stream, we never broke our record. It was a great stream, but we only peaked at around like 300K.
Damn.
I talked to the YouTube reps. Somebody bought that stream.
Somebody bought the stream.
Still holds the record.
Indonesia still holds the record.
Still the savior of that record, chat.
And you'll notice that there's not anger in how he talks about this, even though there's multiple clips of him. I mean, maybe I'll pull up another one. Clips of Speed kind of being noted, tipped off by his team, like, hey, there's something a little bit off here. But yes, the next day, Speed immediately was like, hey guys, so somebody botted it. It was a great stream, but we only got to a max of 300,000, which you'll note is a number much smaller than 1.6 million. And that's the thing about alofoke, that a lot of us in Latin America or Latin American descent have noticed or have thought, but his streams get ridiculous amount of views and they're constant. Like, he's constantly streaming and his stream count is constantly at like several hundreds of thousands, over 1 million. And it's like, look, I'm not saying that it's absolutely impossible, but let's be realistic here. The Dominican Republic is not the biggest country in the planet. A lot of people outside of the Dominican Republic don't know who alofoke is. Most people really don't know who alofoke is outside of the DR and Puerto Rico. Who has the time to be constantly watching him stream, constantly engaging in the chat? Who's really going to be this 1.5 million viewers that he'll get? There's a lot of stuff that people start looking at where it's like, this is a little shaky, man. Folks in the Speed fandom started checking things out and immediately were like, put the fries in the bag. This is the live reality show Planeta Alofoke, day 17. This is just a clip of them in the bedroom. This is just the bedroom. Empty beds. 1.1 million people watching. Anybody who's been around streams knows that this is fucking ridiculous. Then we can get into some of the numbers that start dropping, because alofoke, of course, was very resistant to the idea that he used bots, got very defensive. And so Slips, who's one of the members of Speed's team, who's actually, I think, of Dominican descent, found out that there was 83% desktop usage. This is not the typical demographic breakdown of like people watching streams, especially of young people watching live streams, okay? You can see that there's a lot of people arguing in the chat, people calling him bot-timus prime, the Dominican colors. It's really embarrassing to see these folks that are claiming essentially the Dominican Republic as something that they're defending, as they're really just defending alofoke. He also notes that there is an average view duration of 48 minutes and 51 seconds. Do you understand? That is extremely high for viewership. Most people will view a live stream 10, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, check in here and there. For the average view duration to be 48 minutes and all of it being on desktops, that means you've got like 1 million people at least sitting in front of a laptop like this, watching IShowSpeed fucking drive through Santo Domingo with like 50 million motorcycles and like constant non-stop beeping. And yeah, Speed also mentioned that he would be willing to go back. Slips also dropped more numbers, okay? His ego hurt because he was caught. Speed wouldn't go on live to lie. He never mentioned any names. He was transparent with his community because his community got played. This is the concurrent viewers number that they got. And of course, alofoke really has to be looked at not only as somebody who botted the streams, very likely anyway, but as somebody who basically made this stream a lot worse than it had to be. And you can tell with the way that he's handled this, the level of professionalism that's just not there. Immediately when this accusations reached him, he started shitting all over Speed, saying that nobody knows Speed.
Speed cayó en algo muy estúpido hoy.
Que fue la pilita.
No, fue en algo muy estúpido. Pues entonces él me está demostrando ahora mismo que yo soy más grande que él.
He's showing me that I'm actually bigger than him. That's what he's showing me.
Entonces yo soy más grande que Speed. Yo soy más grande que Speed, entonces.
I'm bigger than Speed.
Mucha bandera de redes, vamos.
No, manda.
Look how awkward everybody feels. Everybody's sitting there right now. All these Dominican dudes are just trying to get on. Sitting there, that's crazy. Damn, that's crazy.
Eso por sí regalo.
They hate us.
¿Cómo se explica?
They're not supporting the Dominican
No hay
Republic.
aplicación.
No están soportando a República Dominicana. Eso fue un error de él. No fue 300K, su pico. Porque el mismo contacto que él tiene en YouTube lo tengo yo.
And he's also very big on bragging that he's got contacts on YouTube. So Speed is much more established in terms of his connections with YouTube, as you might imagine. Alofoke's connections with YouTube basically come down to one dude that's like a part of the Latin American team for YouTube. But because he has that connection, which of course he's going to have at least one or two with how big of a platform he does have, even aside from all the pretty obvious botting. He's like, you could ask that guy, you know, we're obviously legitimate. We're obviously legitimate.
El récord en República Dominicana, gente. Ahora, si él quiere esa retórica, que le dé para allá él. Pero no soportan el talking de los dominicanos, mira.
This is just not a Dominican nationalism issue. Well, it is a nationalism issue, but this is just not about Dominicans, bro. It's about you. If you want to look at what the number one reason for why our stream didn't go the way that other streams have went in the Caribbean, it's because they got a guy on who has never shown that he has a tendency to handle himself professionally, who doesn't really understand much about the Dominican Republic beyond what makes him money, and who clearly doesn't have any integrity, because he'll go from glazing somebody and talking about how amazing their platform is and being like, it's amazing, you know, supporting them in this emotional moment when you got 1 million viewers on the streams, and meanwhile it's your fucking bots that put those numbers up there. This is the type of integrity of a person that becomes such a big face. I mean, look at the difference in subscribers, by the way. This guy is like, we're supposed to believe this guy does triple the numbers that IShowSpeed does on live stream with a percentage of the subscribers, bro. More evidence, okay? This is on Kick after a stream goes offline. Look at the chat. Look at this highly legitimate chat. The stream has been offline the whole time. I mean, come on, you can at least make it look realistic, bro. Come on, bro. Secondhand embarrassment going full throttle right now. Exactly, Rolando. It's just secondhand embarrassment. And like, you want to see embarrassing, bro? This is how classless this shit got. So one of the things that happened that was nice on the stream was that there was a mural, I think Alofoke commissioned, of Speed in the DR that he showed him. After this happened, they went and they dumped paint on it. Alofoke showed up and had people dump paint on the mural that he made. And said, oh, it should be a mural. They're like, we should make a mural of you instead, of you instead. This guy is like a little cult that he has. This is the classlessness. And like this person points out, Speed didn't say anything bad about the DR. He didn't say anything bad about the DR. He went to Jamaica with the DR hat still on. He said he had a great time. He said he wants to go back. But this, just merely saying somebody botted the stream without even pointing fingers at Alofoke when he clearly could have, that suddenly is like, oh, well, traitor to the Dominican Republic. This is absolutely infuriating. And then, in the midst of this, Kick starts limiting his viewer count, which then makes him crash out in a whole different direction. Now he's calling Kick a fraud, which, I mean, I could have told you that.
Maldito fraude.
Maldito fraude.
A la gente dura para proteger a sus estrellas.
What he's saying is, oh, they're protecting their stars by keeping down the people that are really cool, that are really hard like me.
El día demostramos que tu plataforma.
Basically, Kick put a limitation on the stream, and they don't put limitations on streams, on stream viewer counts, without having some type of rule backing it. And their rules say that with bots inflating views, if you use bot to inflate views, we put limitations and sanctions on your channel. So if they put a limit on your channel, Alofoke, That's because they see the evidence.
Desde los ejecutivos, porque no aguantaron el torque del sultán.
They don't. This man is calling himself the Sultan, okay? This is the level of ego that we have. And also, just to show the Sultan in his natural habitat.
Vamos en vivo en Kick.
We're live on Kick. Throwing away the king.
Vamos.
He's having literal temper tantrums live, bro. This is the collapse of a person who, honestly, I have been waiting for his downfall for a minute because he is one of the most negative things that has happened to the public image of the Dominican Republic. In this point in time, it is just, finally, there's an international scandal presenting us with an opportunity to get rid of this guy. At least to take him down a peg or to associate his image more negatively. His image has frankly always been negative. But the levels to which the embarrassment have ratcheted up, it's just like, it's a beautiful thing, honestly. I find it to be a beautiful thing and a silver lining in all of this. The thing is, though, the alofoke doesn't get into this position simply on his own. And he doesn't get into this position without there being a context that produces alofokes. Of course, wherever you have Twitch streamers and you have capitalism, you have big shot influencers that basically exploit all that they can exploit to get a huge public image, to get a ton of viewers. We got Jake Pauls and Logan Pauls here. You know, we got insert name of streamer here. We're not necessarily, as Americans, if we're gonna claim Americans, as Americans, you can't really moralize about there being bad streamers in the DR, given the situation, right? Additionally, you have to study the story of alofoke to understand a lot more, not just about how he got in this position to be the stream guy for IShowSpeed, but also how the Dominican Republic has kind of worked and what kind of cultures kind of persist in the Dominican Republic that caused this. A lot of people will blame this on essentially blackness, they'll blame it on the streets, they'll blame it on shit like that. But this really doesn't have to do with black people and the streets. It's soiling the good white image of the Dominican Republic. Not at all. What this has to do with is poverty and the production of capitalism. Let's talk a little bit more about alofoke. So let's ask, how did someone like alofoke end up in this powerful position? Murgashira Do says this is just Caribbean men scamming. And there's a lot there. Let's get specific. So Esmerlin Santiago Matias Garcia, or alofoke, who also goes by Santiago Matias, is basically this entrepreneur, radio personality, streamer, and discography and record producer. That's really how he got his start, was in the music industry. Of course, music industries worldwide are well known for being diligent and being full of integrity and being great about avoiding exploitation. Music industry people famously not shady. His father was a record industry producer who apparently did not leave him very much, and he did not come from a very rich background at all. The story is that he is essentially a hustler. He started his professional career in 2000. We're going off of Wikipedia and kind of diverge a little bit, but just to give you guys the review. He was an early collaborator with the rapper Vaquero, who's Dominican, and he founds Alofoke Media Group in 2006, or Alofoke Music, as his company through which he is going to promote Dominican music and make a ton of money off of it. You know, we have early clips here. I have early clips here of Alofoke's rap career in 2005. This would be him. As you can tell by that classic voice he's got too. So he started off trying to rap, realized that he didn't have a great talent for it, but he was connected, and through those connections and through his ability to put together some music and then promote that music, he ends up becoming a kind of a big shot. One that essentially gets a monopoly on the Dominican urban music industry in the late 2000s and onward. He still has that to this day. If you're going to blow up in the Dominican Republic as a rapper, you are basically forced to work with alofoke. He has to put you on, and if he doesn't put you on, then it's a problem. There are exceptions to that. There will always be exceptions to that. And given the state of things, maybe that will start to change. But when we talk about Dominican music, we have to talk about a lot of different things that essentially come from African music and with cultural exchange with the rest of the Caribbean and black people worldwide. As you might notice, this is a reggaeton record that was huge in the 2000s. Reggaeton is still huge. It's had these different revivals. Everybody knows Bad Bunny now. Reggaeton comes from, depending on who you ask, Puerto Rico, but also really Panama, but also really Jamaica. And it starts in the Puerto Rico with this particular drum rhythm, which was called dembow. It was called dembow because it's from a Jamaican record called dembow that had a specific drum track that in the early 90s, the Puerto Rican urban scene that was underground started looping to freestyle over. From that urban scene, you get the rise of so many different legends. DJ Playero, you get Daddy Yankee, you get Ivy Queen, you get Nicky Jam, you get all these really important Puerto Rican artists that still have huge impacts today. Later on, you get Tego Calderon, of course you get Don Omar, everybody from that scene. That also comprised of certain people who were of mixed Dominican and Puerto Rican origin, because whenever there's Puerto Rican shit, there's Dominican somewhere. And there's a pretty difficult and sordid history between Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic that in the past, I would say 10 to 20 years has really kind of lightened up. I think Bad Bunny has done a decent job of actually kind of highlighting, like celebrating Dominicans in his music, attributing the times where he uses Dominican music to the Dominican Republic. Of course, Bad Bunny, there's always room for improvement, but it is what it is. Especially in the 20th century, during the most, poverty-stricken years under dictatorship in the Dominican Republic, a lot of Dominicans left to work in Puerto Rico, which in the mid-20th century was a site of development and industry as a territory of the United States. There was a lot of discrimination by Puerto Ricans against Dominicans. And then at the same time, Dominicans who are frankly more Afrodescendiente than Puerto Ricans. In terms of population, there is a larger amount of Black Dominicans or mixed Black Dominicans than there are Black Puerto Ricans, but there are still a lot of Afro-Boricuas. And so there becomes this little pattern there of the Black Dominican worker and the Black Dominican kind of being this site of inspiration for Puerto Rican urban music that goes uncredited. And so alofoke becomes the industry magnet in the late 2000s as Dominican music starts to kind of blow up more and more of, representing Dominican music in that urbano space, not just Puerto Rican music, right? Yeah, Shea Butter notes so many different groups of Dominicans settled in different parts of PR. Squirrels in my Kool-Aid, halfway joking, but I wonder if Lin-Manuel Miranda also lightened some of these relationships. Lightened is a key word. But yes, I do think that In the Heights, which is a 2000s musical that put Lin-Manuel Miranda on, did a lot to, this has been a historical tendency, through New York as the site where all these different Caribbean Latino groups congregate and different Latino groups in general. It builds this kind of pan-Latino solidarity and pan-Latino artistic and intellectual tradition. This is the thing that we get, salsa and of course reggaeton from, because a lot of the early reggaeton artists would obviously, take a lot of inspiration from American hip hop, which came from New York, and they would bounce back and forth between New York and Puerto Rico. I believe Evie Queen talks about that in the Loud podcast. So there's a huge amount of cultural exchange between these different areas. You have New York as this melting pot area for a lot of different immigrants. You have Puerto Rico, you have the Dominican Republic. Of course, there are other characters in this play. Jamaica is essentially where all of this comes from, but also that meaning that Africa is where all of this comes from. These are African musical traditions. I think to really start to highlight that, we have to talk about different Dominican musical forms that alofoke really benefits from and promotes that are now really heavily associated with the Dominican Republic. So we would have to talk about Dominican dembow. This is where things get a little bit confusing with terminology, so just follow me. So like I said, there is a 1990 Jamaican record called Dembow. That's a dance hall record by Shabaranks, to be clear. That beat, Dembow, gets looped and used in early Puerto Rican reggaeton and becomes a signature of Puerto Rican reggaeton. That boom, keep boom, keep boom, keep boom, keep. That's Dembow. That's what that rhythm is called, named after that song. And then you have Dominican Dembow, which now people just refer to as Dembow, but really is technically Dembow Dominicano, that essentially emerges from Dominican intersection with reggaeton. Early reggaeton was very visceral, very dirty, very grimy. Listen to Wata Uva by Plan B as an example. Yo Nunca Me Queda Atrás by Daddy Yankee as an early example. These songs were pretty grimy, they were pretty in-your-face classic records, but as reggaeton needs to adapt to a Puerto Rican landscape that is racist against black people, but slowly incorporating black music of different forms more and more into normal society, you get reggaeton for radio in the early 2000s, which is still very dirty, very nasty, but instead of being focused on street stuff and bragging and oftentimes political messaging, because there was a lot of very political reggaeton in the 90s, you get songs about fucking, songs about romance and love and women, and they have a lot of singing on them. The Dominican dembow tradition then emerges from that as essentially Dominicans saying, well, we like the dirty shit, we like the grimy shit. And so Dominican dembow emerges as this very simple, stripped back, hard-hitting version of reggaeton and really of that dembow rhythm. Then what happens is that it speeds up, because there is this tendency that we're going to talk about a little bit more in a bit within Dominican music of playing everything really fucking fast. And so Dominican dembow takes the original dembow rhythm, and then turns it into or something a little bit in between. giving you guys just a quick example of something. This is probably going to get pulled because I think this has copyright on it, but this is a song called Quisqueyano Dembow by Pablo Pidi. What you might notice about Pablo Pidi is that he's also very black, right? This is a black Dominican rapper who hops onto the rise of Dembow and essentially helps to make it into a more legitimate genre in the Dominican Republic. It was often looked at by the Dominican rappers at the time as like really like lowbrow music. It's always a cycle of like what's lowbrow, and then the lowbrow thing is the obviously more popular thing, and then it gets interpreted and emerges into popular music. So then Dembow becomes quite big in the 2010s. You get artists like El Alfa out of that, Bad Bunny making Dembow records some years later and collaborating with El Alfa on that. You get artists like Toquicha who just dropped an album. That's a whole separate live stream. Anyway, I want to highlight the blackness of Pablo Pidi and the blackness of the origins of Dominican music and Puerto Rican music because it contrasts with a lot of what we understand Dominican identity to be. And to talk about that, we have to talk about Haiti. And to talk about Haiti, we can still talk about alofoke because alofoke is notoriously anti-Haitian. He is virulently anti-Haitian. One of the numerous unsavory moments from the stream of the Dominican Republic is Speed entering this different room, and there's a Haitian dude with a Haitian flag there. And alofoke stands in front of it and basically tries to shut it down. And then you get sycophants like this on Twitter. You'll see them all over social media, all over YouTube comment sections, who are Dominican nationalists essentially, and who put all their energy into talking about how not Haitian Dominicans are and how much Haitians have to leave the country, etc., etc. Oh, maestro alofoke tapando la bandera de Haití en el live de Speed en República Dominicana, patriota, cabra, Dominican flag. Great. Another example of this. This is with Kiko El Crazy, who is another Dembocero Dominicano, who was doing an interview with alofoke. And he's known to be crazy, so this can kind of get filtered through that lens. But the argument that they end up having, which starts a whole bunch of mess, is about Haitians. Because alofoke is constantly pushing far-right anti-Haitian rhetoric. And Kiko El Crazy showcases this.
¿Qué es lo que tú tienes con los haitianos, loco? Deja esa gente tranquila.
Estoy en Miami, convive con ellos, tranquilo, pico. Si tú eres un antipatriota, haz tu papel americano y trata de no venir más nunca aquí.
So, Kiko El Crazy says, what is your problem with Haitian people? And alofoke is giving you that typical anti-immigration rhetoric. You know it, you love it. If you're in any country, you've heard something of it. You don't live here, you're not even from here, because Kiko El Crazy apparently lives in Miami. You don't understand what it's actually like. You're not actually a patriot.
Haz tu papel americano y trata de no venir más nunca aquí.
Go just live in America and get your American passport and never come back here.
Trata de no venir.
Yo sé lo que es inmigrante, por eso te lo digo. Tú vives aquí, yo sé lo que te metan presión por ahí de que porten una tierra. Dame banda.
So Kiko El Crazy is basically saying, I know what it's like to be an immigrant in the United States. So I know that you're fucked up for talking about Haitians this way as immigrants in the Dominican Republic.
Históricamente no es lo mismo, Kiko, no seas ignorante.
Of course, alofoke says something that you'll see come up a lot that we'll talk about a little bit. Historically, it's not like that. It's different. It's not like the way immigrants are treated in the United States. Somebody like alofoke might be treated in the United States. It's different. There's a history there. We'll talk about that history a little bit.
Cállate, óyeme, cállate.
And then this becomes this.
Mentira, tú montas demasiada presión. Eso.
So it just kind of devolves, and there's like a lot of clips of this. At some point, he starts throwing around microphones or something. But Santiago Matias, aka alofoke, is very invested in supporting this anti-Haitian rhetoric. He was in this protest against Luis Abinader, who we'll talk about in a little bit, basically saying he's promoting the Haitian invasion. I mean, you know, just the most virulent anti-immigrant rhetoric. And every time you talk about an invasion, you also have some rumors that alofoke might be Haitian himself. I don't actually know if this is true. I don't think that this is true, but it kind of gets at an interesting question about what Dominican identity is that we'll keep talking about as well. For one, this person points out that this is essentially the same as Trujillo, if this were to be true, because Trujillo, who was a famous genocide heir and dictator of the Dominican Republic, who committed, atrocities against Haitian people and Haitian immigrants, and was so big on fomenting Dominican identity, was actually descended from Haitians. His grandparent was Haitian. Alofoke, on top of all that, is a MAGA supporter. I mean, surprise, surprise. You know those MAGA for Latino people? Alofoke is a classic one of them. Continuamos acompañando al presidente Trump en el Visitor Center del Capitolio en su primera actividad pública luego de su investidura como el presidente 47 de de Estados Unidos hace años minutos. Saludos a mis nuevos amigos. So he's over here just accompanying President Trump in the United States Capitol. He's like been invited there. Really, he wasn't invited there. I think he actually paid to get this, but he's like, you know, chumming it up. I think he has a picture with Trump too somewhere. Just chumming it up with Trump and Trump supporters in his office and shit. This is like actually, I just, to really showcase to you the embarrassing contradictions here. This is a clip of alofoke who really wants to buy a pair of sneakers that are signed by President Trump. This is on his fucking reality show.
¿Lo quieres?
Sí.
¿Te lo vendo aquí en vivo?
Sí.
Entonces hay 11, numerado, firmado.
Bueno, yo tengo dos cosas.
Basically, this guy is a sneaker seller. He has a pair of sneakers that are signed by Donald Trump, and they're very rare because he's got one number on one side and one number on the other side, and it's supposed to just be for friends and family. It's very rare if you want to buy it. And Alofoke is like, I'm gonna buy it. I have a bunch of stuff.
¿Cuánto tú me ofreces?
What are you gonna offer me?
5,000.
No.
5,000, I guess, pesos, but maybe dollars. I don't know. Somebody's already sold them for higher than 5,000. So basically, just you know, sneaker culture, which devolves from hip hop, and this hip hop mogul who starts in reggaeton, who works with vaquero, who works with all these different Dominican rappers, who is the face of Dominican urban music, is anti-Haitian, anti-African, and on top of that, a MAGA supporter. You see that combination there where it's like, oh, sneaker culture. I really want these sneakers because they're a limited edition signed by Donald Trump pair of sneakers. I mean, this is the type of embarrassing shit that we're talking about. And just to go over some other controversies for Alofoke, just to hammer home also the kind of controversies that he constantly is in, which is part of his brand. You know, he's a shock jock at the end of the day. There was a stream earlier this year wherein Alofoke talks about how an assassinated 22-year-old woman called Masha, and in the middle of the conversation, he says that he wants to be a forensic officer, a forensic police officer, so that he could do necrophilia to her. This is the type of shit that he says, right? This grown-ass fucking man. This really great representation for the Dominican Republic. It just pisses me off, too, because it's like, why couldn't this have been researched by Speedy's team, you know? They couldn't have thought that there was anybody else to reach out to, but at the same time, Alofoke has such a massive grip on that country, he wouldn't let anybody else get that shit without starting some sort of war. And just to also see the crossover here in terms of how Dominicans like this, specifically Dominicans like this, really think of themselves and think about their own identity. Later this year, you know, we're talking about February and then we're talking about March, and then this just happened in May. But in March, Venezuela beat the US in the World Baseball Classic. And Alofoke went online and basically just started talking shit and saying, we have the same watches that Michael Garcia, the player for Venezuela, has. We got the same, I always forget what coche means. We have the same apartments as him, and we also have bread. También tenemos pan. You know what that means. You know exactly what that means. You know, he's making a joke about the hunger crisis in Venezuela. Oh, we got these watches too, but we also have bread. This is the kind of pro-US, essentially white nationalist sentiment that Alofoke likes to peddle. But here's the thing. Alofoke, as somebody else points out, is not just somebody who emerges from nowhere. This kind of figure emerges throughout the Caribbean and all over the Dominican Republic throughout history. And he is the quintessential example of somebody who comes from a position of trauma, who comes from a position of, you know, dealing with the after effects of colonialism and imperialism, and not only internalizes it in terms of his opinions, but utilizes it. And utilizes it through his trauma at the same time to become this virulent, raging, angry nationalist figure, which also, not coincidentally, but primarily, is a great way to make money in this media environment. So I want to talk now about some history and some theory. Again, I'm not an expert in any of these fields, but I try to do a little bit of reading in preparation for this. And one book that I found really interesting is a book by Christina, Cecelia, Davidson called Dominican Crossroads. It's about somebody named H.C.C. Astwood, who was a minister and missionary for a Protestant church, who was black, a black Caribbean person. He was born in the British Caribbean and spent a lot of time in the Dominican Republic. And so Davidson just basically, through telling his story, also showcases a lot of the contradictions and difficulties within international black politics at this time. He epitomized black masculine respectability, but he also became a duplicitous, scheming figure who used deception and engaged in racist moral politics to command authority. And in particular, there's a theory or a conceptual thing that Davidson establishes in this book. She's not the first to do it, but I think she articulates it pretty well, talking about Davidson in a way that we can understand when talking about Alofoke. Basically, she talks about the idea of the tigre, or the idea of tigueraje, which is tiguereism, essentially. Now, a tigre is not a tigre. Tigre is the word in Spanish for tiger. Tigre is, I think, derived from tiger, from tigre, but essentially becomes a word with a specific connotation. Davidson defines it as meaning a person who rises from poverty to a position of wealth and power, often through illicit means. She actually cites somebody there. She says that this term is especially relevant in Astwood's case because it emerged in the late 19th century as a derogatory term for Afro-descendant men who lived in the barrios outside the capital and who surpassed their class status. Placing Astwood within the Tigre Dominicano framework both highlights the parallels between African American and Dominican folk hero narratives and emphasizes the similarities between white Americans and Euro Dominicans' anxieties over black political authority in their respective countries. So basically, tigre emerges as a racialized or racist term to describe black hustlers in the Dominican Republic. Okay, wherever you have folks who are in positions of poverty, this is often, a convention or a traditional thing that comes from black descended people that some people might connect to, like trickster god religious kind of affiliations or different cultural values, whatever. It's a conversation that that's way above my pay grade. But regardless, it's a racialized term to describe black people from low status who know how to hustle and who, through whatever means necessary, will work their way into a position of security and power. And tigre now is a very common term used by Dominicans, as no longer carries this racialized idea. Shocker that racial ideas get kind of dissipated over time in different cultures. But essentially to describe somebody who's street smart and who can hustle. Joseo is the word that we use in the Dominican Republic. Tú estás joseando. Yo siempre estoy en mi joseo. In Puerto Rico they say borrega. We say joseo, literally hustle, joseo. Alofoke is a tigre, right? You could describe him as a classic tigre figure. This is a person whose blackness and whose poverty and whose Dominicanness, whose Caribbeanness makes him one of the classic disenfranchised people, especially in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and still to this day. And a lot of people in those positions end up working their way through figuring out different social norms, how to defy them and follow them at different points whenever it convenes them, how to be pro-black and anti-black at the same time whenever it convenes them, in order to build themselves a reputation within blackness while also enough respectability outside of blackness, and all the while, again, making money, building status for themselves. You guys say josear too? Okay, good. So now we should really then have a conversation about blackness. This is where it gets interesting. I hope you guys are enjoying the stream so far. Oh wow, 341. 1.6. Let's talk about Dominicans and blackness. You have probably heard about the meme, I know black, I Dominican. That was a joke made by Godfrey, a comedian who is, I believe, Nigerian American. And it's a complicated thing. If the question is, are Dominicans black? Are Dominicans not black? Do Dominicans consider themselves black? First of all, somebody like me, I don't consider myself black. I'm not black. Like, it is what it is. I would never be racialized as black within a million years. I have some black people within my family. And of course, there's mixes in my family. But I obviously came out the way I came out. Shout out to my Chinese grandfather. So it is what it is. And there's a lot of Dominicans, though not the majority. I would really honestly say not the majority, who just don't have black phenotypical features and wouldn't be racialized as black. And that's not a coincidence either. We'll get into it a little bit. But as far as black Dominicans and mixed black Dominicans, to use an antiquated and now offensive term, mulattos, right? A really important historical term. That's why I use it. These folks have a complicated relationship with their own blackness that the understanding the concept of tigueraje will kind of help you understand. But in particular, I saw somebody talk about this on Twitter named Eurydice Jones, and this particular skit, this guy has been making a bunch of skits like this.
Oh my God, it's the famous criminal gangster hood nigga. Ponte pa la pila. I don't like you hanging around with those people. You already know that though. That's why you do it, because you want to give me heart attack. They're gonna say, Ricky! Bruh, bruh, bruh. And you dead. Just like that. I'm gonna write in your gravestone, my son's so stupid because he wanna be nigga when he not nigga. Nigga nunca.
So you will see a lot of jokes like this on Instagram and on different social media platforms. If you find them funny, I totally understand. A lot of Dominicans will find them funny, because there is a lot of internalized anti-blackness even among black Dominicans. But this person points out something really important, even though I would say it's a little bit more complicated from my own experience and from what I've seen on social media. Someone says, I've been noticing a trend of people framing Dominican-style anti-blackness as something largely perpetrated by actual black and often dark-skinned Dominicans. I have to say that this is extremely colorist and lets light-skinned and white Dominicans off the hooks for their crimes. And this, I think, is really important to point out. Where you might still see very Afro-feature and dark-skinned Dominicans make these jokes, you really don't see it from that demographic. You see it from the mixed black Dominicans sometimes, and especially from the mestizo and white Dominicans, ones who literally have family from Europe, right, that migrated to the Dominican Republic over the past 2 centuries, or ones that are mestizo. That type of anti-blackness is firmly perpetrated by them, and it has a lot to do with class as well as to do with race, as well as to do with Christianity. So this is where we had to have this conversation, okay? What is it with Dominicans and race? What's up with Dominicans and race? How do Dominicans think of themselves with race? Are Americans just obsessed with race? I was on the Dominican subreddit, and there's a lot of people that are like, oh, the Americans with your obsession with race, trying to transpose that into the Dominican Republic, trying to force your ideas of race onto the Dominican Republic, when it's not like that here, okay? It's not like that. No es así. We have descendancy from Africans and from Tainos and from Europeos. We are white and black, we are mixed. And we accept, we embrace our culture, we embrace our raíces. Do you? Do we? Because last I checked, this is like a 99% Christian country, the Dominican Republic. That's not exactly African religion. And what we're going to talk about today too, as borrowing from what we just talked about, is the way that a lot of blackness ends up getting transposed into a lot of different directions. But just to showcase exactly what I'm talking about, this is one of these strange, I think he just changed his fucking Twitter name. Strange, right-wing Dominican Twitter posters. That's how 90% of us Dominicans are. Así somos el 90% de los dominicanos. Porque el extranjero piensa que somos físicamente como los vecinos. Los vecinos meaning our neighbors, the Haitians. This is what 90% of Dominicans look like, he says. This is not what 90% of Dominicans look like. Okay? Go to Santo Domingo right now. Right now. Land in the airport. Land in the Santo Domingo airport. Let me know what you see. This guy, he barely exists in Puerto Rico. But of course, he's one of these, he's doing a whole kind of manosphere adjacent thing too. Oh, I'm a Chad, look at how hot I am. Hot mixed light blood. That's what we've got. This person has made a bunch of tweets responding to these same things, right? The same Twitter account was basically talking about the speed stream and saying, oh, those were actually Haitians. Remember when I told you about how some people are rumoring that alofoke is Haitian? There's a lot of people, or at least a significant small subsection of people, who are from the Dominican Republic, who will make 90% of the argument that I'm making. What an embarrassment. You've embarrassed our country. You've embarrassed our culture. This is not our culture. Da da da. And then the last 10% is just racism. It's actually because they're black. So alofoke is doing all this stuff to showcase how cool he is with Trump and how much he hates Haitians. Or, I don't hate them. I just want them out of my country because I'm a proud Dominican. Whatever. And meanwhile, as soon as you start embarrassing Dominicans, what do those light Dominicans do? The same thing that they did when they oppressed you at the beginning. You're not really Dominican. Actually, you're Haitian. Actually, you're African. And that's why. That's the problem. That's the corruption in our country, is the Africanness. This is frankly a pretty recent discourse in the Dominican Republic. It's something that comes in the 20th century. And this person rightly points out, it took 4 hours for a single white person to appear in Speed's live broadcast. I cannot independently confirm nor deny that. But this is the type of logic. Yeah, our president is Lebanese, okay? Lebanese. White Lebanese. They exist. But this is the kind of logic that permeates in especially elite light-skinned circles in the Dominican Republic that has all these negative effects. You're seeing that there are efforts to do the opposite. This is an example from somebody named Anthony Almonte. So they're talking about basically the importance of students being able to show up to school with their natural hair, which is something that is a whole controversy in the Dominican Republic, where there's absolutely no anti-blackness, but it is considered professional to straighten your hair. For various reasons, people straighten their hair. Beauty standards, professionalism, avoidance of migration officers. We'll get there. I love my curls. I love my, my tight curls. And I love them. I want to have my hair with braids, or if not, with an afro. She has straightened hair, she has curly hair. We're happy, we're different. This exists, okay? And this is a discourse that has kind of gone up and down in Dominican history, but especially with those discourses becoming popular in the US in the 2010s. Of course, that translates internationally. That texturism shit, yeah. Exactly what Femi says, texturism. The Dominican style perfect blowout is a thing for a reason. Exactly. And yes, there's a lot of Levantine and North African people in the Caribbean. So this is the kind of thing that you see normalized in the Dominican Republic. But in particular, and I'm sorry for this, but we're going to show something that's quite disturbing and sad, so just warnings ahead. This is very tied to the hunt against Haitian people. This is a particular organization called Cañeros Organizados, showcasing Dominican immigration officers harassing, separating families, kidnapping Black Dominicans of Haitian descent off of the street. Not the street either, like in rural communities in particular. Because there's a big difference between rural DR and street DR or urban DR. That's another thing. So this is part of a long-standing migration reality in the Dominican Republic. This is an article from Institute's Eye. 10 years fighting for nationality in the Dominican Republic. 10 years ago, on the 23rd of September 2013, some 130,000 Dominicans of Haitian descent who were born and raised in the Dominican Republic woke up to find that they no longer had citizenship of the country they called home. Overnight, the Constitutional Court ruled that people born in the Dominican Republic to foreign parents without a regular migration status had never been entitled to Dominican nationality. It is estimated that this ruling still affects 137,000 people today. This court ruling was called La Sentencia and has been described by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights as the product of structural racial discrimination against persons of Haitian origin and descent, and by civil society commentators as civil genocide. This has been a long history of this in the Dominican Republic, and right now, with every country in the world having a falling apart moment and a massive sort of civil unrest moment regarding immigration, that's how Haitian discourse is in the Dominican Republic right now. The Haitian is the migrant that must be expelled. And, of course, a migrant like, my grandfather, who frankly had a fake ID when he came to the Dominican Republic, Sang, is not my grandfather's actual last name. He changed it because he had to get a fake ID from a Chinese, essentially bootlegger, to migrate out of China during the early communist revolution. Not the revolution itself, but like the early communist state. My grandfather, he had money. We didn't see that money because things happened, but that's how that worked. Of course, though, anti-Haitianism has been a massive part of Dominican national discourse for a long time. Currently, speaking of current events and the way it manifests now, we have to talk about Israel. This is an article from Black Agenda Report. For years, Haiti's border with the Dominican Republic has become increasingly militarized. The Dominican Republic constructs an island-spanning border wall staffed entirely by Dominican troops and military police to control the flow of people and goods to and from Haiti. And central to this conflict is the resource of water. The Dominican Republic and Haiti share a watershed. So there's conflict over water, there's a border wall, and then you have our current president, Luis Abinader, also a child of migrants to the Dominican Republic because he is of Lebanese descent. He has presided over an increasingly anti-Haitian set of policies at the border, including mass deportations of Haitian immigrants and large deployments of soldiers to the borderlands. And powerful international interests have used this crisis as an opportunity for profit and political leverage across the land, including, shocker, the Israeli occupation, megacorporations, and diplomats. When you have Israel and Israeli companies doing all of the shit that they do in terms of technologies for surveillance and technologies for border control and military technology, anywhere in the world you can see that shit being sold to governments that are using it to control migration, but not just to control it, right? It's a whole separate conversation that we can have about how migration discourse is wrong-headed, how it makes no sense, how it actually costs us a lot more than it supposedly saves us, doesn't make our countries better at all. It just costs a fuck ton of money to kill and imprison people. But what it does is it allows for the migrant worker to be as impoverished as possible. It allows for the continuing large amounts of undocumented Haitian workers in the Dominican Republic to be exploited for extremely low wages, as well as anybody black in the Dominican Republic who's not rich to be exploited for low wages by employers who can threaten them with deportation and harassment and violence. So that's how that works. I'll get into why I have decided to move away from calling the DR, the Israel, the Caribbean as being kind of coins in the chat towards the end of my conversation. But the facts are the facts. A lot of Dominicans are Zionists. You see a lot of Dominicans hesitate, even in the midst of this massive moment of the ongoing genocide of Palestinians. You see a lot of homeland Dominicans, especially who are of a particular status, who are virulent Christians and who are thus Christian Zionists. And that paves a perfect way for the Dominican Republic to continue its tight relations with Israel. Abinader is an interesting case because you might then connote him as a far-right leader, one of numerous far-right leaders in Latin America. But just going to show how much political affiliation is really a first world conception, let's say, Luis Abinader ran as a social democrat. I would frankly call Luis Abinader the Barack Obama of the Dominican Republic. In the same way that they ran on a progressive platform, that they are both, ethnic minorities technically within the set country, in that they were elected in a fervor of hope about progressivism potentially growing in the Dominican Republic, and that they have passed certain policies in terms of development, in terms of cooperation with China, have made certain statements like Abinader condemning the US attacks on Iran to present a left-leaning, good governance image of his government. And then the real reason that I compare him to Barack Obama is that they both preside over an extremely regimented, technologically developed border regime. They are both immigrant haters. Barack Obama deported tons and tons and tons of people, and he did so in a way that was more systematized than we had ever seen before. It was quieter, it was more sophisticated, so to speak, and so a lot of people connoted him as being so much more humane on immigrants, when in the reality, Tom Homan, who became the leader of ICE, who was appointed the head of ICE by Donald Trump, was a Barack Obama hire, somebody that Barack Obama handed medals to for his development of ICE under Barack Obama's regime. So very similar things happening, and that can also give you a sense as to where Dominicans are at politically right now, where there's an especially kind of fake progressivism, especially kind of complicit and what's the word? Yeah, deporter-in-chief is the term that I would use for Obama and Abinader. As an educated Dominican, I know many hate you. Thank you, Mr. G. I hope not, but it is what it is. Maybe they will now. Warwick makes a good point. Yeah, Abinader ran socially more progressive and more pro-capital. And that means working with China, but it also means working with Israel. It also means working with the United States. Just raise as much capital as possible. Chinyere says, the treatment of Haitians in the DR reminds me of how Israelis treat Palestinians. I think that there are similarities, but I'll spoil what I'm going to get into. There are key differences in that. For one, as you probably noted from what I just read, a lot of Dominicans are Haitian. Or really, a lot of Dominicans and Haitians descend from the same people. African slaves who were trafficked to the island of Hispaniola, as well as, in the Dominican case, different Spaniards and European settlers that came later on. So that's a big difference that I think needs to be highlighted, but we'll get into it. Complacency, thank you. So you see that there's a spirit of complacency that has kind of always been there, but especially now when you have a more socially progressive and considered left-leaning president like Luis Abinader, who somebody like alofoke can posture as being against because he's too soft against the Haitian invasion, but in reality has been one of the most militant about strengthening the border. I don't know how you would compare it at that point, but in terms of his efficiency with it, the guy's up there, okay? I don't get why that's so hard to comprehend. Exactly. We'll talk about this more in terms of the connections between Haitians and Dominicans, but you don't really get to see also that Haitians and Dominicans aren't natural enemies, okay? You have, in this instance, more footage from these accounts that post this stuff, instances where border patrols and border police are essentially kidnapping Afro-Dominicans and Haitian Dominicans under the regime of border control, and you have different Dominicans of different complexions showing up and saying this is wrong, you're separating her from her child is over there. They're coming in to help. They're throwing people off of the bike, like the border patrols off of the bike, and you see that they start getting fucking pissed off or whatever. So, the idea that every Dominican hates every Haitian simply, I think, is, I don't want to say it's overblown because it has to be highlighted, but at the same time, it's not comparable to the Israeli conception of Palestinians. Even many of the far-right Dominicans are, especially virulent about kicking Haitians out and about Africans being backwards and all of this. They don't have an exterminationist rhetoric nearly as much as your average right-wing Zionist who would be considered more to the left. The average Dominican is like, they should go there to their country, or they should go back to Africa or whatever the fuck, which is exterminationist in a different sense. Both of those are exterminationists in a different sense. But Israelis, especially the Israeli regimes that we see now, are very forward about saying, we want to kill them. We want to kill Palestinians. We want to remove them from their land. We want them to never come back. Dominicans will also have a rhetoric of, well, we accept Haitians. They just lie about them being Haitian. A lot of these same right-wingers will look at a Haitian Dominican, like, there's a baseball player named Jeffrey Yampierre who was like, I'm Haitian actually. My name was Yampierre, that comes from Jean-Pierre, and I'm proud of that. And they'll be like, see, this is one of the good ones because he admits where he's from, and we don't have a problem with that. We have a problem with the people that lie. So it has a lot more similarities to, and I think Americans love to use Israelis as a negative example for everything, but it has a lot more similarities to the way Americans treat Mexicans at the border. That same far-right exterminationist anti-immigrant thought process. Or a lot of similarities to how Europeans treat Muslims in their countries, right? So there are similarities for sure that are worth pointing out between Israel's treatment of Palestinians, or Israel's genocide against Palestinians, and Dominican's essential genocide against Haitians. But there are very, very vast differences. And that's not even getting into the history of how Israelis got to Israel versus how Dominicans got to the Dominican Republic, especially outside of the urban capitals, okay? Because rural areas in the Dominican Republic are quite different in their demographics than the Santo Domingo elite. Philosopher asks, why does it matter? I'm trying to see what that was in response to. When you see the history of racism in the Dominican Republic, it's also something that really manifested at the end of the 19th century, in the 20th century. Prior to the emergence of this guy here, Rafael Leonidas Trujillo, who we'll talk about a little bit, but frankly, there's a lot of content about Trujillo out there that you can check out. Prior to this, you had a history of the rural populations of the Dominican Republic essentially being comfortable with Haitians or okay with Haitians. The vast majority of people who had these anti-black discourses and anti-Haitian discourses were, again, these elites that considered themselves or would be considered mestizo, white, descended from Spaniards, etc. There's absolutely a lot of genocidal Dominicans because there's a significant contingent of people like Ifemi was talking about, Trujillistas, who see this, what Trujillo did. The Parsi massacre has been mentioned a bunch of times, coordinated massacres of Haitians at the border. I remember living in the Dominican Republic and people joking about, oh, say perejil to Haitian people, because Haitian people would not be able to pronounce perejil typically because of their accent, and then that would tip off the military to know that they're Haitian and kill them. This is something that hasn't been confirmed necessarily by like hard evidence, but is a key part of the mythology and the understanding of what thing it is, of where they come from. Oh, okay, philosopher, I see what you're talking about. So racism in the Dominican Republic is a huge part of what constitutes the institutions and the way that Dominicans reflect on themselves. Dominicans love to be like, well, we're all the races, we can't be racist, but there's a very obvious violent bias against Africans and against Afro-descended things. So this is from a paper called Muertos Civiles, citing that race scholars of the Dominican Republic have noted approximately 90% of Dominicans are of African descent. That's where somebody like Danilo Medina, who was mentioned in the chat, former president, can claim racism doesn't exist there because we're all different races. Obviously, that's not the case. Further from this paper, state-sanctioned categories of race and politically motivated anti-Haitian sentiment continue to shape ideas around blackness and Haitianness in the country. Up until 2014, women were reporting that JCE officials were requesting that they straighten their hair before taking their photo for their ID cards. This is the kind of thing that you would do, and it's, again, tied to migration, avoiding the feds, it's tied to acceptability politics, respectability politics, and all of that. But at the same time, this is a country that is, by some measures, 90% mixed black or black. There's connections, like Soulful Oat Milk said, like you can connect it with how Mexican Americans joined ICE to deport their own. We just want people to do it the right way. That's such a dominant discourse across the board. You find that among people in any ethnic group. Pero ese se lo dices al dominicano promedio y no lo quieren entender. Solo saben acusarte de haitiano. Right. As Miss LaBelle Kitty points out, there's a hierarchy of phenotypes. They might not be honest about it, but everyone else sees it. Frankly, this is true of all of Latin America, as we covered in my video about white Latinos. It's pigmentocracy. People refer to it as colorism, but frankly, it is Europeans that are constantly at the head of the financial order in Latin America, as well as light-skinned and white people. And then the darker-skinned people are always the poorest. This is just constant, right? Somebody like that guy I showed you earlier, that is an example of one of these light, mixed, well-to-do people that exist in this country. Another thing that I noticed that people were talking about with regards to alofoke's stream and, making these reactionary comments about how it's just the African shit that they show, it's the African shit. I remember seeing somebody who was like, he's just showed the dembow and the choperia, which is a word that they use for hood rat shit. Choperia. Well, he didn't show beautiful parts of our culture like the merengue and the bachata. Folks, where do you think those things come from? This is bachata, and if you know anything about bachata, one of the dominant music forms and dance forms in the Dominican Republic, you know that it comes from African music and Spanish guitar. You also know that it emerges from rural communities, and infamously, bachata was also very persecuted by the Balaguerista government and the post-Trujillo right wing in the 70s and 80s. As this style of music became very popular in rural communities, it became seen as lowbrow, as rebellious, and as African in origin. Similar thing to how dembow was treated now, to how hip-hop was treated, how reggaeton was treated. These are always the low forms of, black culture that exists in a country that holds it back, up until more and more white and light-skinned people start doing it and combining it with more European traditional elements. And then, oh, it's a beautiful part of our culture that we need to show off. So again, this is how blackness becomes a key fundamental thing in the Dominican Republic, but then hides itself through narratives created by light-skinned European elites. But what I really, really want to get into talking about now too is this particular idea like Africanness isn't celebrated and blackness isn't celebrated in the Dominican Republic. Because people from Santo Domingo have got y'all fooled, people from the urban areas have got y'all fooled. And discourses about Latin America that are not had by people who have some cursory knowledge about Latin America are always misleading people into thinking that there's a good Latin American country that loves black people and a bad one that doesn't love black people. It's not really that simple. I'll start here by talking about something that is a very, very popular and long-standing traditional form in the Dominican Republic. It's called gaga. Gaga Dominicano is essentially the same thing as rara Haitiano. Rara is a Haitian version of the same thing. It's basically African dancing in parades that in rural communities are very tied to spiritual and religious practices. Okay. That support them. There's more money funneled into them. In Dominican Republic, it's a bit more of a sordid story where this type of stuff is called satanic a lot more. It's still called that by those same groups of people in Colombia and Cuba and Brazil. It's called satanic and African and low class and whatever. And there's just a lot less money behind it. This sounds like suku but faster. Straight de Cale vibes. Exactly. It's just demonstrably very much similar to Haitianness, okay, to Haitian traditions. But Dominicans so racist they stole Rara and renamed it Gaga. That's so funny. It's not, but that's the thing. It's not what the racists did. The racists want to have nothing to do with this. Does Rara Gaga come from Haiti? See, you guys are still thinking about this like these Haitian, like the country of Haiti and the country of the Dominican Republic have always existed and they've always been different people. No, it's the same traditions that take on slightly different forms depending on what part of the island you were a part of. Because it's African people across the island, right? Same with Palo, right? So as Empire's notes, Rara was probably pronounced with a French guttural R sound, which is close to G, Rara, and it evolved differently in both sides, okay? Rara does come from Haiti and often has a political message. Rara comes from Haiti, Gaga comes from the Dominican Republic. It's the same tradition that evolved differently in different places. Okay? It evolved differently in different places. You can look up the historical record and see this. Of course, there's also a lot that still gets borrowed from Haitians. So I will say this. A lot of the practitioners of Gaga and other forms we'll talk about in the Dominican Republic are near the border. And there's a lot of cultural exchange between Haitians and Dominicans. And so a lot of the people also who are going to maintain that tradition more proudly and more vocally will be Haitians given the differences in the governments in the two countries. But ultimately, it's just a matter of like who you were colonized by. The idea that like somebody is naturally racially Haitian and somebody is naturally racially Dominican is a brand new term that was created, especially in the 20th century, to establish white supremacy in the Dominican Republic. Squirrels in my Kool-Aid put it perfectly. African traditional spirituality / religious / cultural practices that were retained through enslavement and had different variations depending on where the ancestors ended up. If you're Latino in the chat, yeah, shout out different versions of it in different places that you've experienced. In Brazil, they have a bunch of this. This is where I want to talk about somebody named Enero Lisa Núñez, the queen of a traditional musical form called salve. As you'll see, it's a crowd full of black kids and black people in the Dominican Republic, in the part of Santo Domingo, called Villa Mella. I'm Haitian American with esposa y niña. Dominicans cannot pronounce gaga the French way, so they say gaga. Right. It's just different pronunciation emergences, right? Taíno, as far as the Taínos, There is a general acceptance or agreement that the Taínos, the different indigenous groups that existed in the Dominican Republic that we called Taínos, and in Haiti that we called Taínos, essentially are not there anymore. Their traditions, their way of life was not kept up. So people commonly have 5 to 10% Taíno blood among Dominicans, 2%, 3%, but they don't maintain as an indigenous group. Separate conversation about indigeneity. So yeah, as Reese's Pieces notes, this Enero Lisa performance, it gives a lot of African vibes, right? But if I told you what she's saying in the song, you'll know it's more than just vibes. The words of the song are, Yo soy un baleño y vengo de los olivos a darle la mano al enfermo y a levantar los caídos. If you know what Ogun or Ogum is, that's a deity from Yoruba. Ogun Baleño, as a result, is a deity in something that most people don't know exists called Dominican Voodoo or Las 21 Divisiones. It is very much connected to Haitian Voodoo, but has separate folks that are worshipped, different Loa or Lua, like Anaïs Apie or Ogun Baleño. So as you can see, Ogun, that's a major Orisha in Yoruba. Ogun Baleño is essentially a Loa of warriors and soldiers. He's syncretized with St. James or Santiago. So this is Dominican Voodoo. This type of music comes from Dominican, African, religious syncretistic traditions. And that's why the music also sounds like this. The rest of the song is she's citing other different saints. Now, unfortunately, Enero Lisa Nunez passed away a couple of months ago. She is a fixture of this place called Villa Moya in the Dominican Republic that has kept, some of those African traditions alive, including Salve, and she became fairly famous on an international basis. And you can find that there are channels that will cover this connection between Africans and African religion and practices and traditions in the Dominican Republic, like this one called African Dominican. This person came to visit Enero Lisa.
What an honor to meet
before she passed away.
This Dominican legend. Hola, mami, mucho gusto. Mama Enero Lisa Nunez of Los Congo y Grupo Salve.
Hola, hola, Valentina, ¿cómo te estás, mi amor?
Gracias.
Yo soy un baleño y vengo de los olivos a darle la mano al enfermo y a levantar los caídos.
So this is one of those things that you just don't get taught about. And you don't get taught about it if you're Dominican, much less if you're someone from somewhere else. You only get taught, I know Black and Dominican, you get taught about Christianity, you get taught about the café con leche. But I've been Dominican my whole life. I'm almost 30. This kind of thing has always been connoted with Haitians as if Haitians are this race completely separate with completely separate traditions. And the idea was always that the Africanness is essentially almost exterminated in the Dominican Republic in favor of civilized European cultural things. As Ari says, they'll say it's brujeria, but it's this type of practice, it's not exterminable. And there's so much of it. And unfortunately, Enero Lisa died, a few months ago. And there was a lot of uproar because the government officials didn't hold an emergency event to commemorate her during her funeral, which a lot of people saw as emblematic of just how much this kind of thing is institutionally denied and buried and hidden. And it just breaks my heart, man. It just breaks my heart. I spent a lot of time just thinking Dominicans just don't accept that thing. They just don't accept their Africanness. And I realized that people say this and they don't leave Santo Domingo. They don't even leave South Santo Domingo. They don't go up north. They don't go to the campo. They don't go to the many rural areas in which you see these large concentrations of Blacker Dominicans who will often carry on these traditions. The reality is that the anti-Blackness in our country is a result of elites dominating our country who put forward a narrative about European descendancy as a way to try to ensure some type of security for the Dominican Republic and to benefit from anti-Blackness. And even in Haiti there was suppression of those things, let alone DR. So it just really kills me to see that. And another example of this is actually a folk hero named Papa Livorio. I'll show you a trailer about a film that was made a few years ago that was based on this folklore.
Sí.
So essentially, Papa Livorio, or Olivorio Mateo was his, given name, is a huge figure also in Dominican voodoo, and he was a revolutionary. He was a rural black Dominican guerrilla who faced off with not only the Dominican government but also the United States. He continuously violently rebelled against the United States occupation of the Dominican Republic. There's an altar in a city, San Juan de la Maguana, dedicated to him, where he's from. And so San Juan, that's the same place where you see, actually this is San Luis, but you see a lot of Gaga tradition also in San Juan de la Maguana and in other parts of the Dominican Republic. I wrote something essentially to summate all this complicated shit I just talked to you about as well as I could. And, you guys can feel free to have your agreements and disagreements with it. But I think this is the best way that I can verbalize it. And also there's a degree to which this isn't even my thing to talk about because I'm not black. That said, many Dominicans claim and even celebrate their blackness. Many don't. Some are also simply not black. Above all else, however, blackness has been a fluid identity category that Dominicans can often claim or detach from, depending on convenience and necessity for survival. Especially in the 19th century, when Dominican independence was a fragile project at best, in the wake of Haitian independence and amidst slave rebellion and abolition movements internationally, one can see how anti-black ideas posturing Dominicans as European could become so popular as a method of ensuring safety and entrenching inequality. And that's where we're going to finish while talking about some history. So this is from Dominican Republic and National History by Frank Moya Pons, previously mentioned. As you probably know, and as I mentioned at the intro, Santo Domingo is the site of the beginning of the end, right? It is the site of the end of the world for indigenous Americans in a lot of ways. Eva says they try to make voodoo seem evil when it's just a beautiful community getting together to learn herbs and stories to help each other. Yeah. Was it the Try Guys that did a story in New Orleans about the spiritual traditions in New Orleans that are very connected? As you probably know, Christopher Columbus is a bastard and we don't fuck with him. He sucks and we don't fuck with him. This is a passage describing essentially what happened to the Taínos. If you don't know, one of many things that happened to them, the captured Indians were put to work in the gold mines where they were grossly overworked, mistreated, and underfed. In 1501, the crown had declared that the Indians were free and should be treated as such, but no one obeyed those orders. In 1503, Ovando convinced the queen that if the Indians were not forced to work in the mines, the Spaniards would leave the island and the whole colony would be lost. Pressed by a dire need for gold to pay expenses in Europe, the crown legalized the system of distributing the Indians among the Spaniards to work the mines. The only condition was that the recipients of Indians teach them the Catholic faith. The system of encomiendas was legally sanctioned by the crown, December 20th, 1503. Once the Indians entered the mines, hunger and disease literally wiped them out. Those who did manage to survive for 8 to 12 months in the mines became so desperate that many eventually committed suicide in collective ceremonies. Pregnant women systematically aborted or killed their own children to prevent them from becoming slaves. The volume of deaths was such that a 1508 census revealed that there were only 60,000 Indians left out of an original population of around 400,000. This is less than 20 years. This is from a Colombian writer named Manuel Zapata Olivella. This is a book called Las claves mágicas de América, where he describes that further. He says to harmonize faith and ambition, the Spanish conquistadors essentially stopped being inspired by the Holy Scriptures, and they wrote a new Third Testament, essentially, that was capable of justifying genocide of race and cultures. This new creed was called civilization, and this is what gives birth to the mestizaje that we know today throughout Latin America. I also want to talk a bit about a great book called The Mulatto Republic by April Mays, which you should definitely check out, that talks about the development of anti-blackness in discourses in the 19th century, because it wasn't always like that. Hispanicismo, the elevation of cultural norms and values associated with Spain and Spanish colonialism, was present in all currents of nationalist thought elaborated in the late 19th century. But not all conceptualizations of Dominican national identity were anti-black or anti-Haitian. Mays argues that although Hispanicismo had been since the 1880s a key element in intellectual conversations about Dominicanidad, Dominicanness, its significance became more pronounced in towns such as San Pedro de Macorís as native-born elites expanded their ranks to include wealthy white immigrants from Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Spain. Finally, I demonstrate that while the path from Hispanicismo toward official Hispanidad was never linear, a patriarchal, racist, and authoritarian representation of the Dominican nation became viable and acceptable among modernizing elites by the 1920s. As a result, I conclude, Trujillo-era nationalism was an ideological invention unique to the dictatorship that drew on long-held ideas that national unity derived from Dominicans is culturally pure Hispanic tradition. Proponents of Hispanidad nationalism, however, injected Hispanicismo with a profound pessimism about the Dominican nation's future and complemented this bleary outlook with a virulent anti-black rhetoric that resonated with negrophobic intellectual traditions but was more vitriolic in its application. And then more from Christina Cecelia Davidson's book. The tigre is an apt metaphor, the tigre like alofoke, for what U.S. academics and mainstream media have labeled Dominican self-hatred, negrophobia, and anti-Haitianism. This U.S. stereotype has denied Dominicans the spectrum of racial sentiment and vaivén, ebb and flow of black expression that existed across Latin America, where blackness is a moving target. The pervasive U.S. stereotype that Dominicans deny their own blackness, as Raj Chetty and Amaury Rodriguez has written, can only lead to the conclusion that Dominicans have not invested in forging ties with their international brothers and sisters in the region, nor even the U.S. However, thinking through the tigre figure as a metaphor for the Dominican blackness demonstrates the ways in which tigueraje, trickery, factored into black individuals' struggles for survival, even while such trickery sometimes counteracted collective black liberation. Going further on that and how that develops. On the island's eastern side, Euro-Dominicans knew that their geographic and historical ties to Haiti and their large black population made their territory a joint target of the Western world's scorn. Consequently, their lobbying efforts to unencumber the Dominican nation from the era's racist politics of non-recognition began at the moment of separation from Haiti in 1844. To curry favor for Dominican independence, Dominican agents in Washington claimed that whites governed the eastern side of the island, where, as they alleged, the general population was racially and culturally distinct from Haitians, despite Haitians' own class and color diversity. Remember, there was a lot of mixed race Haitians, especially elite mixed race Haitians that, existed on the island for, and to some degree still exist on the island. Dominican elites portrayed the East as a land full of whites and mulattoes in danger of pure black Haitian invasion. And that was a principal reason why some Dominican elites sought annexation to a European power of the United States. In the Dominican Republic right now, 22.8% of people live in poverty, ranking 82 out of 193 countries on the 2023 to 24 Human Development Index. So this is a big improvement from where things were before in the Dominican Republic. Huge sustained economic growth and stability, but there's still a lot of inequality. Undernutrition, obesity, cost the country 2.6% of its GDP. And of course, you have the threats of natural disasters. You also have 1 out of 3 households lacking access to a nutritious diet. The development in the Dominican Republic has been specifically capitalist and very neglectful of any common person's interest, regardless of whether they were white or black Dominican leaders, mixed Dominican leaders, regardless of whether or not they were Dominican leaders that claimed to be left or right, that were anti-Haitian or more friendly towards Haitians. And this is where you get something like the jet set collapse. I don't know if you guys heard about this, but this occurred in June of 2025. It was something that everybody's phone was blowing up about if you were Dominican. 235 Dominicans died in a nightclub. Somebody was leaving a message to the owner of the nightclub, one of the workers, that there's an important issue that needs to be checked at the nightclub. The ceiling panels are breaking, a piece of the ceiling is falling off, and it's dangerous. It'd be good to take a look at the whole roof whenever there's a chance. Needless to say, that did not happen. And 8 hours later, the club opened doors. There was a event. This club often was a space for well-to-do celebrities who were usually black or black mixed, as well as, just regular middle-class people, let's say, to dance bachata and other Dominican music like merengue. They had Dance Mondays that were quite famous. And then at 11:40 p.m., a piece of the roof fell, and an hour later, the roof caved in. 235 people died. 180 were rescued with injuries and trauma that still linger. This is all being talked about here today without me getting into talking about very much about the Trujillo regime, the dictatorship that, came thanks to U.S. imperialism, or the U.S. imperial invasion against Juan Bosch in the 60s to cut down on a essentially socialist, democrat socialist movement that was quickly then replaced by Joaquin Balaguer's dictatorship, which was, basically a leftover of Trujillo-era dictatorship. My big point today is that Santo Domingo and the wider Dominican Republic is a key site of colonialism and American imperialism, and nobody seems to understand that. I laugh at Dominicans all the time. I laugh at tight t-shirt Dominicans all the time, and the slang, and, a lot of the ignorances are things that I recognize, but I think people love to displace the failures of the world onto easy targets. It is easy to make fun of the Dominican for internalized anti-blackness. It is easy to make fun of the Dominican for backwardness, for, blanqueamiento. It is easy to make fun of the Dominican for being ridiculous. But a lot of the ridiculousness is a trauma response, and a lot of it is also just celebratory silliness that comes from inconceivable trauma, inconceivable violence. Dominicans will laugh at ourselves. Dominicans laugh at each other. Dominicans laugh at everything. And they laugh at everything because nothing is funny. And so I just propose that as we look at this conversation about what happened with IShowSpeed and DR, we avoid this narrative of, oh, he's going to war with the DR, or, oh, the DR hates IShowSpeed. This is just the result of a particular brand of tigueraje, a particular type of capitalist, a particular type of hustler, taking advantage of systemic inequality and underdevelopment and devastation in the country that he was a victim of in order to mobilize for more regimes of destruction. And as a result, you get what you get. But there is a Dominican Republic that is different from the one you guys are seeing. And it doesn't just have to be us propounding that Dominicans are exclusively African. Yes, there are mixes of different cultures. That's the whole thing about syncretistic religion, mixing Christianity and Yoruba practices, and sometimes mixing in, Taino practices. There's also a connection with a beautiful land with mountains and rivers and lagoons and beautiful beaches and people who grow their own food and who dance in the campo. And none of it is perfect and nobody is perfect. But the reason that I got hesitant about making content about the Dominican Republic to criticize it as a Dominican, when I really wanted to for a while, is that y'all don't have the right. Americans especially. You do not have the right to be pointing at the Dominican Republic because it's America's fault and the West's fault that the Dominican Republic is the way that it is, as well as Haiti. You don't have the right as Americans and Europeans and other Latin Americans to sit and to put all of this hatred of Haitians that exists in the Dominican Republic squarely on the shoulders of the Dominican Republic when it exists predominantly in all of your countries too. We have a current president right now who very famously or infamously said that Haitian people eat dogs and has launched his own regime of kicking out Haitian migrants. In Latin America, in Chile, in Colombia, every country in Latin America has the same discourse about kicking out Haitians. And in Europe, forget about it. French people don't even enter the room. I don't give a fuck about this, we're the real Pan-Africanist talk that Macron wants to do. Get out the room. And the rest of Europeans, with the way that you're talking about Muslims and the way that you're talking about Africans in your country, you have absolutely no right. You've participated and benefited from and built these countries, these first world established developed countries, off of the back of impoverishing countries like the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And now you want to sit around and joke about, oh, how ignorant and how dumb the Dominican is? I'm not interested in it, and I'm not interested in making a blunt comparison of the Dominican Republic to Israel. Even as much as there are comparisons that are worth making, even as much as the Dominican Republic collaborates, the Dominican government collaborates with Israel to surveil and to kill and to kidnap and to incarcerate people, particularly African people. I'm not interested in that. You know why? Because Dominicans and Haitians come from Africans. All Africans that came to that island because of Europeans that were forcibly kidnapped and shipped to the island of what was called Hispaniola, but previously was called Cecelia or Haiti. And when Haiti got its revolution, its first ever in the modern world and only ever slave rebellion that became an independence revolution, many people on the east side celebrated, seeing themselves as essentially the same people as Haitians, black people and mixed black people, and what became the later Dominican Republic. This narrative that people had that, oh, the Haitian invasion, the Haitian occupation of the Dominican Republic in the 1820s, that invasion didn't require killing a single person. You know why? Because the vast majority of Dominicans were black and mixed black Dominicans who were like, yeah, we actually like Haiti, we want to be part of Haiti. And that's how Spanish Haiti was formed. And not to get off on a separate tangent, but it is because of the elite classes of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, especially the colonial elements dominating the Dominican Republic and outside of it. But in particular, the insistence on adhering to plantation economies, plantation agriculture, the insistence on, developing rapidly in the devastation of the war with France that led to Haitian Revolution. All of these after effects of colonialism and the debt, don't forget the fucking debt. All of that led to splintering and opportunistic people, especially Euro-descendant people, taking advantage of that to foment themselves as the new elites of the Dominican Republic, or to retain their elite status as in a new independent country, which could be modeled in their image. And if you learned that in Haiti in high school, Ari, I didn't learn it. We learned certain things in Dominican Sociales class. I wasn't really able to speak Spanish well enough to understand it. I've had to do this research on my own. Especially like Dominican families don't teach each other this stuff. In order for the Dominican Republic to avoid being embarrassed the way that we were just now, We have to change the discourse. We have to actually embrace the African roots of our country and the disenfranchised people of our country, not just simply talk about it. And you can kick out as many Haitians as you want, kill as many Haitians as you want. It's not going to fucking change. You're just going to further and further cement yourself as a genocide heir in a waste of space. Until, though, France and Spain and the United States run the Dominican Republic and Haiti their money, I need y'all to focus on your own debt to Haiti. And we can talk about the Dominican Republic's role in that. But don't act like it's separate from yours.